Hey everyone, it's Jen. I'm here today with my Genrethon and mid-month wrap-up for April. So this month I participated in my first ever readathon, and that readathon was Genrethon, which happened last week and ended on Sunday. And I managed to read 8 different books in Genrethon. And Genrethon, the whole point was to read at least 3 different books in 3 different genres, so I'm really pleased by the amount of books I read and how many genres I managed to tackle. The first book I read for Genrethon was The Tsar of Love and Techno by Anthony Marra, and it is a collection of short stories. And the short stories were set in Russia from different time periods. The earliest one was 1937, and then they went all the way up to about 2012, 2013. And it was actually a really fascinating book because I haven't read a lot of literature based in contemporary Russia, and I actually don't know a whole lot about Russian history, which I feel detracted a little bit from my understanding of this book, especially because a lot of it talks about Chechnya, and I'm really unfamiliar with anything to do with Chechnya, really. So it was a really interesting, fascinating book that made me want to learn some more historical things, but also was really excellent because a lot of it revolved around art and music, and those are things that I'm just a really big sucker for. So I gave that book 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read for Genrethon was The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. And this is a shorter, very short, sort of horror fantasy novella. So I decided to read this book for Genrethon because I haven't read a horror book in a very long time. And I've only read one of Neil Gaiman's other books, American Gods, and I thought that this one seemed like a good one to read for Genrethon because it was a little different, a little bit not what I was expecting. And I actually really liked it, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. So in this story, it's told as a flashback when this man goes back to his childhood home after many years to sort of attend a funeral and ends up going to the house down the street where he used to hang out with this family there, and he's sort of like repressed or forgotten a lot of the memories, and they just sort of start coming back, and they tell the story, and it's actually really fun. It's a really fascinating book, and the magic system is really interesting, and the way it's told was really engrossing, and I really liked it. And so I finished that book on Monday. Also on Monday, I started and finished Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire. So this is a new book that I was very excited about. It wasn't on my Genrethon TBR, but my hold from the library came through on Monday, so I just decided to start reading it because I was so excited. This book is about children who travel to fantasy worlds, sort of like Narnia, and what happens when they come back. And this woman is running a sort of boarding school for these kids to help them readjust to living a normal life again. And so the premise of the book really drew me in, but the payoff wasn't quite what I was expecting. A lot of the book gets taken up with this sort of like mystery element that pops up in the second half that I wasn't really expecting and I didn't really care too much about. I thought the characters were really interesting, but the book could have benefited from a little bit more subtlety in writing and characterization. I would have liked to see more of these characters, and so I would have liked the story to be a little bit longer, as this book was only 173 pages. But overall, I found it really intriguing and interesting, even if it wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. So I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. And Monday was actually a really great day for the readathon for me because I also started and completed Legion by Brandon Sanderson, which is, again, a very short little book. Brandon Sanderson, I've been really loving his books, what I've read so far, but I've only read his high fantasy novels, and this one is more of an urban fantasy sci-fi novel. So it was interesting for me to see how Brandon Sanderson's like fantasy writing transfers over to writing like sort of a sci-fi urban adventure in our world. So I thought it was really cool. So this story is about a man named Steven who has all these different aspects, all these sort of manifested personalities that he sort of hallucinates, and so basically makes him like a super genius, and people have him help solve crimes for them. And so that was what this was about. He solves a little mystery, and it's like quite a short little quick little read. And I read the next book as well because I liked this one so much that I decided to go out and pick up Legion Skin Deep by Brandon Sanderson, which is the sequel. And so the main mystery from the first book is sort of mentioned but not really explored again because there was an object that they acquired at the end that I thought they were going to do a lot more with, but it wasn't. So this one was a little bit longer. but it was just as good as the first one, and I really hope that Brandon Sanderson publishes more of these stories because I'm very interested to see what's going to happen with the main character, Stephen, and all of his different personalities and like what's going to happen. It was very exciting and very cool, and I'm really glad that I picked these up. Oh, and I forgot to say, for both of the Legion books, I gave them both 4 out of 5 stars. So on the Thursday of the readathon, I read The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Again, another very short little book, only about 100 pages. So this is a classic sci-fi novel. It was written at the end of the 19th century, and it is actually the first book to use the device of the time machine for time travel adventures. So I thought it was a great read just because I've watched a lot of time machine TV shows, and by that I mostly mean Doctor Who, and so I was really excited to read this book. I thought it had a lot of like political and social connotations that definitely Wells was trying to talk about, and so it was interesting to read it in that light, but mostly I was like, I'm here for the sci-fi, so I ended up giving this book 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read for Genrethon is a nonfiction book, and I actually have not read any nonfiction yet this year, so I was really happy to read The Art of Forgery by Noah Charney. So I am studying art history and the decorative arts and design, so this book was right up my alley subject-wise, although I've had it on my shelf ever since it came out. I bought this book, I think the week it came out, so I was very excited for this because I think forgery is a very fascinating subject, and I've never read a full book on it before. And this book was actually really good. I loved it. It had so many pictures, which is great. See, I just opened the book randomly, and there's images. It's my favorite thing. And I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars because I wanted a little bit more from it, because one, we have Girl with a Pearl Earring on the cover here, but there's one Vermeer forger who's talked about, but he didn't forge copies of this famous work. He just made new works and said they were by Vermeer. Anyways, I also wish that Charney had talked a little bit more about forging of decorative art objects, but overall the stuff that was in here was really good. A few of the forgers I had heard of before, but a lot of the stories were new to me, so I very much like this and very much recommend it. The other nonfiction book that I read this month, actually listened to, was Yes Please by Amy Poehler, which is her memoir, and I gave Yes Please 3.5 out of 5 stars. I actually have the physical copy of Yes Please back in the States, but I did not bring it with me, and I decided that I really wanted to read it, so I decided to listen to it because my library had a digital copy available. And I have a bit of a problem with audiobooks. I've never been very good at being able to listen to them, just because I mostly find that I don't like the narrators, or I just want to be actually reading the words because it helps me take in the information better. I am glad that the book that I listened to was Amy Poehler's book, because Amy Poehler was the one who was reading it, and I really like her TV. I really love her in Parks and Recreation, so I was like, okay, I can listen to Amy Poehler for 7.5 hours, the way I wouldn't be able to listen to someone who annoyed me after a chapter or 2 of listening. Overall, I liked this book. I felt that I probably got some stuff from the recording that I wouldn't have gotten by reading it, just because there's a lot of back and forth with her and her friends who she has come record with her. Although I do feel like I was missing what I'm sure were lots of like pictures that were included in the original copy. So when I go home, I'm definitely going to page through it and look at all the images. But overall, I liked the book. I would have liked if she had talked a little bit more about Parks and Recreation or her friendship with Tina Fey, because those are the things I feel like I know her the most well for, and those weren't really the things she talked about, which was interesting because I don't know a lot about her work with the Upright Citizens Brigade or her early comedic stuff, so that was very interesting, but I just wanted more about the stuff that I knew about. Overall, I did really enjoy parts of the audiobook, so I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. And those are all the books I read for Genrethon, so that was 8 different books. So overall, I read just over 1,100 pages and listened to 7.5 hours of audiobook. So I think that's a really great accomplishment. Out of the 5 books on my TBR, I read 4 of them, and then the other 4 were ones that weren't on my TBR, but ones that I read instead because I just felt like it. So yeah, I'm pretty proud of myself for reading that much for Genrethon, and I had a really great time. And I figured since I was wrapping up so many books for Genrethon, I would talk about the other 3 books that I've read so far this month that I did not read as part of Genrethon. So the first book that I read in April was Mr. Fox by Helen Oyemi. And I picked up this book because I'm very excited for her collection of short stories that actually comes out in the UK tomorrow. And I really wanted to read something else of hers before I picked that up, just to sort of get me in the mood. And Mr. Fox is actually her first novel, and I really liked it. The book is a little bit of a challenging read. It sort of jumps all over the place perspective-wise, and it took me a little bit of time to sort of get into it, but I started reading it and I was really intrigued, and it really made me want to work to understand this book. The way it's structured is really interesting, and I don't really want to describe it because I feel like it's something you have to experience for yourself. But I knew almost nothing about this book going into it except for that it was about a man who was a writer. And I love books about people who are writers, or books about books and that type of thing, and so that's really all I needed to pick it up. It's definitely one that I want to reread now that I've already experienced the story, just to see what more I get out of it and see if there's any things that I missed. But it was really interesting, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Also, before Genrethon, I read Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. And this is a classic novel written towards the end of the 19th century, around the time of Napoleon III. And it was really interesting. It's a classic that I picked up just because I've had it on my shelf for quite some time. And I was going to France or later this month, so I wanted to read something French. And I liked it a lot. I can see why a lot of people don't like Emma Bovary, the main character, but I was very sympathetic towards her just because I feel like I've read a lot of books in the past that deal with sort of her situation, but in a more contemporary way, so I definitely feel like this book was sort of the template upon which those are based, because Emma Bovary, she's sort of this young woman who's married to an older man who she finds very boring, and she lives a life in the country, and she's sort of depressed and sad about it, and sort of goes and has all these affairs, and I'm like, oh yeah, I've read that book. But I enjoyed it thoroughly, although, it is a classic novel, so karma is very evident, and just sort of Emma has done all these terrible things, and so therefore not only she, but her whole family must be punished. But yeah, it was definitely a very interesting read, sort of a great French novel, and a pretty easy classic to read. If I'm being honest, it wasn't difficult or flowery the way that I find Dickens to be, so definitely one that's easy to pick up. And I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And then I have one more book that I read post-Genrethon, and that is The Bees by Lillian Paul. This book actually took me a little bit of time to get into. I read the first 80 or so pages at the beginning of the month, and I just wasn't feeling it. The story I found was very difficult to get into, and the writing just didn't really help. But I ended up finishing it all in about one sitting last night. I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars because I thought the premise was really interesting. It is about a bee, Flora 717, and she is the sort of lowest member of the hive, but then she sort of goes and just does all these different tasks in all different parts of the hive, so we really get to see everything that's happening in the hive, but it felt like the story was just sort of meandering and lost for about the first half of the book, and I was sort of like, okay, are we just getting a tour of the hive through Flora? But then action really started to pick up in the second half, and you could tell there was something a little bit off. And for me, I thought it was fairly obvious what was going to happen, but I thought it was very interesting, the premise, but it was a little, I didn't really like the way that it was written. It felt, especially because we as the reader are being thrown into this experience that's completely new to us, because Flora is a bee, and so she experiences the world in a very different way than we do, but I felt it wasn't articulated as well as it could have been in this book. So I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Alright, so that's what I've read for the first half of April. So I've read 11 books so far, and I still have about half the month to go, so I'm very excited to see what I will get to next on my TBR. So if you participated in Genrethon, let me know down below how you did, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye!